So if you have questions during it, feel free to interrupt. I want to try to save some time at the end for questions, but sometimes it's better to do it while we're in the conversation. So let's go ahead and get started. What I want to do, oh, let me see. I pulled up the wrong deck here. Sorry, 1 second. Oh, okay. I just have the wrong title on it. I was fooling with slides today. I have a whole bunch of presentations I'm doing, and I switched out the title slide at the last minute, so I'm still good. This is really about how to enable adaptive space. So what we're going to talk about today is complexity leadership and what we do when we're leading in complexity, and the requirement that when we're in it, we need to adapt. So my focus in my research and in my work has been on how to enable people and organizations for adaptability through a leadership lens. I said that people now know what complexity is. I don't think anybody has a question about that. There's so many things happening right now in complexity. I usually do a slide of different kinds of trends or complexity events, but I just put up a general one. I'll tell you the one that I'm most interested in at the moment is really what's happening around leadership of people in organizations. So if you're following the story of Elon Musk at Twitter and the way that he's leading at Twitter, the kinds of things that are happening there, I think that it has incredible ramifications. And we're seeing in the news right now all of the efforts and the announcements that companies are making of bringing people back to work. There's been a constant tension between the people who want to stay at home and the companies that feel they need to bring them back to work. They were waiting for the right time to do this, and now they're starting to make announcements. I'm not sure it's going to work very well. And then I'm just going to give a quick other story. I have kids in their 20s, and they've been dealing with a lot of issues around layoffs or companies that that are in the process of being acquired and acquisitions. And companies are doing layoffs now in ways they never have before. So they're just letting people go. They're not letting them back in the office. They're not giving notice. It's a pretty harsh way of managing in response to all the things that are going on. And I think that's going to backfire. So all of these dynamics that are happening create tensions. And in those tensions, they end up looking like this picture. You think you're going to drive one behavior, but you end up driving another behavior. You think you lead or prepare or plan for something, and then before you know it, something else happens. Or you try to lead with control like we did in the past, and you find that you don't really have control. And in the current moment, workers still tend to have some control, but who knows when and how that's going to switch again. It will switch. So in complexity, we need to lead differently. And what we need to understand, and I think we all know this by now, is that old models of leadership were managerial and they were focused on top down. But now what we need is new models of leadership that are more collaborative. And the big change that I want to suggest to you all today is to think about leadership not as a manager-subordinate relationship or a hierarchical relation, but instead as a co-creation. So all of the work that I do is building on the idea of relational leadership, that leadership is a relational dynamic or a relational interaction, and it occurs in relation. So if I'm trying to lead, or if I'm in a follower role or trying to be a good follower, I'm leading in relation to my leader or my follower, or I'm also doing it in relation to context. So lots of things going on with this view of leadership as a co-creation and the need to consider how we generate more collaboration. So in complexity, it requires that we enable an adaptive response. This is the law of requisite complexity that was built on the law of requisite variety, Ross Ashby's law of requisite variety. And essentially what it says that when we're in complexity, it takes complexity to beat complexity. So there are 3 zones that we talk about. In complexity, there's the chaos zone, the complexity zone, and the order zone. So the top one is chaos. And in chaos, we know that what happens is people feel like there's no pattern, there's no connection, there's no making sense of anything that's going on around you. So here we see dots that are not connected, no pattern, nothing rational or explicable in the situation that we're in. But what happens is,
maybe Mary, I'm interested in this question, but Kim posed, are wicked problems still preferred content to describe the complex adaptive systems? Like, where do wicked problems live in this spectrum from complexity? I'm assuming somewhere between complexity and chaos or on that border, but what are your thoughts on?
I think wicked problems are complexity. And I think people use the term wicked because they don't have the complexity language or understanding. But essentially, these wicked problems are big ones that we don't know how to solve and that have huge interactive elements to them. So essentially, they're complexity. Now, I don't think they're chaos, because if we can define the problem, then it's probably not chaos. We know enough to know that there's a pattern or a question to ask in the problem. Or is this okay? So in the case of wicked problems, or in the case of complexity, let's talk about complexity when it's happening. When a complexity event occurs, it pushes people out of equilibrium. So it takes them out of their order, it takes them out of what they know of their path that they're on, and it shoots them into something else. And in extreme cases of complexity, it can feel like chaos. So what people do is, when they experience it as chaos, they drive it down to order. And this is what we call the order response. So the problem of the order response is that it focuses on stability. And typically what it tries to do is drive back to an old order. So people who are putting complexity or taken off their path, they want to go back on it. So they say, no, it hasn't changed. Things are the same. We're just going to keep operating the way that we were operating before. And that's a pull back to equilibrium. So what complexity is doing is pulling you out of equilibrium, and systems naturally pull back to equilibrium. But the problem is, if we're in complexity and we go to the order response, we end up in stagnation, and in extreme cases, death. We know this now from COVID. Again, I mentioned COVID at the beginning. COVID was an extreme complexity example, and in extreme complexity, it really is death. A system or a person will die. So stagnation is death. If you don't change, you die. It's that simple. It's that scary. What we need instead is an adaptive response. So this is what the work that we've been doing for the last couple decades, and really trying to understand what this looks like. So I want to ask you to just think for yourself for a moment, and I don't need answers. I just want you to think about it. If you have to fill this box in, and you have to say, what is an adaptive response? In your own heads, what would that look like? So that's the question I want to pose, and give you a second to think about that. So I think we know what a chaos response is. Chaos is when there's no pattern. People have no idea what to do, running scared, no real viable response. An order response is one that goes to the traditional order, the systems that we know. So what is an adaptive response? Well, that's really the question that we've been asking in our work. So the chaos response is the dots, no pattern. The order response looks more like the hierarchical, managerial kind of approach that we're used to. The adaptive response is this. So I draw this picture in, and I ask groups quite often if they know what this is a picture of. And I'm surprised how many people don't know that this kind of a diagram. I mean, we see the one below is called an org chart, right? So what would this be called? Are there any answers in the chat box, Miljan?
No, just about network, matrix,
yes, good.
playbook, adaptive capacity.
Got it. First one. So you guys are good. I asked so many people, they don't know. They never come up with network, and it's really a network map. So it doesn't surprise me you're a complexity group that you would know what this is. I just want to make you aware. A lot of people are not aware that this is a network map. So essentially what it's saying is that if we're going to have an adaptive response, what we need is a networked solution. Networked, meaning networked interactions or dynamics. All right, so we're going to keep that in mind as we go through then and talk about what the adaptive process is. As we were doing the work, this became clear to me in a paper that I wrote in 2018, where the adaptive process really started to emerge and surface. We had seen it, but we didn't know exactly what we were seeing. So in the adaptive process, we have two systems. We have an entrepreneurial system and an operational system. And when we're in complexity, or when we're in an adaptive situation, these two things go into tension. So entrepreneurial is pushing for novelty, for new ideas. Operational is pushing for stability, efficiency, productivity, results. They go into tension. And quite often what happens is that traditional leadership training tells us that in tension, that's a bad thing. People don't like it. So it's not only the leaders who don't like it, it's the people in the system, the followers, the subordinates who don't, the employees who don't want the tension. So what they do is leaders step in and get rid of the tension. The beautiful work that was done on this was the early work by Heifetz, where he emphasized the importance of tension in adaptive leadership. So anybody who knows that understands this dynamic. So we started seeing this in the hospitals that we were studying around 2007 and 8, when we had a grant from Booz Allen Hamilton to study leadership and adaptability in the healthcare industry. And what we saw was healthcare was clearly in complexity in the US. They were having to drive a lot of change. And some systems were responding to that with this response. They were fighting it, they were getting rid of tension, and they were trying to go back to old order. So what we need instead of an order response is an adaptive response. So here I'm going to just take that entrepreneurial and operational and make it a need to innovate and a need to produce. So pressures come in on the system. They present an adaptive challenge where we have to have an adaptive solution. A problem for which there's no known solution. We need to innovate and create. We have to do something different to survive. So that automatically kicks in ideation. Automatically. Everybody does this. This is not something that's the hard part. We have the need to innovate, the ideation process that occurs, but it clashes up against the need to produce. So what we've done is we've renamed this from tension, because people weren't understanding tension before complexity. We've renamed it conflicting. Essentially what it looks like is ideas bashing up against each other. In some literatures, they refer to this as creative abrasion. So conflicting is heterogeneous ideas, needs, worldviews, perspectives bumping up against each other in conflict or in tension. And it's necessary. So for us to be able to generate an adaptive response, we have to engage this. The one core finding in the early work that really stood out to me and has stood out to me for everything we've done is the importance of what we call the tension dynamic underlying complexity, that we need to engage the tension to be able to generate or drive adaptability. So that's what this is getting at, conflicting. But here's the thing that surfaced in the later part of the 2010s, the last decade, where we really started to understand that the key to this is not just the conflicting, but the second piece that goes along with it, which is connecting. So we only get adaptability if we're able to find connections amidst the conflicting. So this is, in today's world, we see it. Everybody's conflicting, right? Because of social media, everybody has a voice. We've got all of these groups. Of course, they find their the echo chambers that they operate in, they connect there, but we can't seem to be able to connect across the conflicting. We see it with our politicians, we see it with leaders, we see it all over the place. So my premise is that the number one challenge for leadership today is how to get this connecting. How do we get connecting amidst conflicting? All right, when we do that, when we engage this dynamic properly, it's adaptive space. So adaptive space is the conditions that allow this adaptive process that generates an adaptive outcome to occur. And it's really this whole picture here. So what adaptive space does is it creates the conditions for pressures to generate the conflicting, the tension dynamic, activate the tension dynamic, but then combine it with connecting so that people are able to find connections that generate some insight or some novelty or some learning or some adaptive solution that can then be put into the system in the form of adaptability. All right, so this is the basic adaptive process. And I'm going to pause. Are there any questions coming up here?
There was one regarding the reference to the book that you mentioned.
Oh, it was Ron Heifetz. So Ronald Heifetz at Harvard did a lot of work on adaptive leadership. I think his first book was Leadership Without Easy Answers. And then he also had a book on adaptive leadership. He really discussed this. When I used to use a Harvard Business Review article that he wrote with Marty Linsky, and it talked about followers want comfort, but what they need is tension. So it's the idea of how do you the conflict. He also got at the idea of being on the dance floor and on the balcony, zooming in and out kind of idea. Really beneficial kinds of skills for understanding how to engage in complexity. Okay, so if you get this basic process, this is the core fundamental simple dynamic of complexity, and it crosses everything. So it's fractal. This same dynamic occurs across levels. So it occurs in our head, it occurs between two people, it occurs in groups, it occurs in organizations, it occurs in society. This adaptive process of engaging the tension between the need to innovate and the need to produce in adaptive space to generate adaptive outcomes is the core dynamic we need to understand to lead in complexity. The fascinating thing about this is that we discovered this in our complexity leadership work, but then Benjamin Lichtenstein, I wonder if I have his book here. I usually show it. Oh, I don't have it on my desk right now. He wrote a book on generative emergence. And he did a whole review. If you're interested in complexity, Benjamin Lichtenstein's book on generative emergence is the best you can find for this from this standpoint. He reviewed all of the complexity theories from science and brought it in, and then determined that dissipative structures theory from Prigogine was the best for understanding what's going on. And when we take his and my work and what we've discovered in all of our qual work from the mid-2000s, they map on perfectly. So I wrote a paper in 2021 in Journal of Change Management. You can look that one up. It's called Change Leadership for a Changed World, where I show the mapping of his and our work, and that this process that we're describing here really is a generative emergence process. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take this same dynamic of the adaptive process, which is a general dynamic, and again, it can occur in my head. So the example in my head is I want to do complexity work because I see that the world is changing, and I see that the leadership work that I'm doing isn't relevant to what people need. So I start to innovate. Let's go back to this for a second. I start to innovate. I feel pressure around it because I know that what's happening out in the world isn't right, but I have the need to produce. It's pushed up against the need to produce because in my field, I'm required to publish. That's where we get our rewards and our recognition. So I have to publish. That's my need to produce. And in the publications, they view the world in the old way. So I have this tension dynamic, and I have to engage that in adaptive space. Now, it could be that the need to produce wipes it out and I say, forget it, this is too hard, I'm not going to do it. I stay in my old world. But I decide that I want to continue to push for adaptability. So I engage the adaptive space of conflicting and connecting to figure out how I can maneuver this and make it through. And the way that I did that was I had parallel paths. I would take some of the new work I was doing and I would do the complexity work, but I had the old work where I'm pushing the edge of the old paradigm. All right, so that's the adaptive outcome. That's the adaptive process that can occur in a person's head in terms of how they're deciding how to do it, or it can occur at the organizational level. So now we'll look at the organizational level and we'll see that pressures come in. Oh, we see the network map. So here again, the first thing we have to do is we have to reframe our thinking about organizations away from rigid hierarchical org charts to networks. So we start with viewing an organization as a network. Then we say pressures come in, and when the pressures come in, they pressure a local part of the system. This is what makes it so hard in organizations is people want to drive change, but everybody's experiencing something different in their own local. So what I'm trying to drive in my local, in my area, isn't going to fit what somebody else is trying to drive in their local area. And therefore it's difficult to connect. Okay, so the pressures come in on the local. In our early work, we were interested in ideation. We quickly dropped that because what we found was when the pressures come in, systems automatically start this process. The entrepreneurial system is there. It pushes for learning, innovation, novelty, growth. People have ideas. Ideas are cheap, that's not the problem. So they start to ideate on the local level, and they'll do a process called collective creativity, where they generate the idea and then they start to circulate it with other people. Once they get an idea and they've tested it and it's working in the local, they try to drive it out into the organization more broadly. And this is where the problems really occur. In many organizations, they don't have adaptive space. And if you don't have adaptive space, you don't have the conditions for that adaptation to occur, for the conflicting and connecting process. So ideas get shut down. It's a brick wall. It's a wall of resistance, whatever you want to call it, frozen middle. There are all kinds of terms for this, bureaucracy, but essentially it gets shut down. So for this to work in an organization, the key thing they need to have is adaptive space that allows the adaptability to occur. All right, so ideas will start to go out. And then if they can make it across adaptive space, if they can engage the conflicting and connecting to get more, for new order to happen, it has to be formalized and incorporated into the operational system. There's a huge process here. Is there a question?
Maybe I have a question here. Like, would adaptive space equal to like loosening up corporate policies? Like, for instance, if we have rigid policies in organization, would that limit that adaptive space and therefore kind of loosening up the guardrails to allow for that emergence in adaptive space? Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Absolutely. So sorry, I have a cold, so my throat, you can kind of hear it in my voice. So what happened with COVID was, because it was a complexity event, it naturally opened up adaptive space, which is what complexity does. But that was such an extreme adaptive space that people had no choice, right? So if you think about what happened in COVID, all rules went out the window. People didn't think that you could work from home. They didn't think that remote would work. They didn't think a lot of things that they were doing. Doctors, I work with healthcare, they didn't think that you could treat a patient without putting a hand on them. They were really adamant about that for many years, that you had to have the physical body in front of you to be able to treat a patient. COVID changed all of that. So it naturally opened a window of adaptive space that loosened the systems for change. And now what we're seeing is that adaptive space is shutting back down. So now we're getting back to rigid rules. Yes.
Or would you also say that it was not adaptive in a sense, like where everybody just applied like lockdowns, and lockdowns were not necessarily adaptive space?
So here's the really fascinating thing, and I didn't know this before COVID. People were asking me questions. They said, well, how come in the early responses, the authoritarian governments had the best response? It's an interesting question, right? They were the best at making sure that when things started, everybody was operating in a way that they were saving lives. So what we discovered is that in the kind of response you can have, an adaptive response, it can come more on the entrepreneurial side or more on the operational side. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean it's always the innovative thing. It could be that you're going more to an operational response that's helping drive adaptability in the system too. So I think lockdowns were the right thing to do. I don't think they were maladaptive. I think they were incredibly adaptive, and people really kind of lose focus of what they were for. They were really to protect our healthcare systems. Okay. But in addition, people didn't want to die. I mean, that's the reality of it. People went on their own and locked themselves in their houses in the US. We didn't have a true lockdown in the US. My daughter lives in England. They had true lockdowns there. They were not allowed to leave their flat for months. So I mean, we think that lockdowns in the US were bad, but a lot of that was self-imposed by people as well. So I think that the idea of adaptive space is we need to create organizations that recognize that when there's a complexity event happening, when there are pressures on the system, they allow the system the space to be able to adapt. And they do that by engaging the conflicting and connecting.
Thank you for explaining that.
Okay. So now with this, we have new kinds of leadership. So we're going to map leadership onto this. And we're going to say that there are different kinds of leadership we need to think about today that we didn't think about in the past. So one is entrepreneurial leadership. And this is, a lot of people think this is starting your own business. Yes. But there's also entrepreneurial leadership that happens inside the organization. So we need to recognize those people who can do this, who can engage the new ideas, who can advance and innovate. And the good news here is a lot of people don't know how to do this. So a lot of people are like, well, I'm not going to do it. You don't need to have everybody doing entrepreneurial. That's the best news. You just need enough entrepreneurial thinkers that they can generate the ideas. What you really need is the enabling leadership. So this is the biggest change we see, is that we've got to create new training and development programs that help to foster enabling leadership. And enabling leadership is leadership that creates the conditions of adaptive space. So it sets up those opportunities for the system to be loosened up to accept change. It doesn't stay there all the time. It's just when a complexity event occurs and you need to try to inject the the novelty in. That's why we call it space. It's not a system. It's there when you need the space. It's completely fluid and dynamic. And then there's a third one, which is operational leadership. We've always had this, but what's different about operational and the complexity dynamic is that what it does is it helps to accommodate adaptation. So most operational leadership is rigid, and it has a bias to no, to say no, the bias to no. They say, anytime you come with an idea, we can't do that. It's not going to work. We've tried that before. Too big of an issue. We can't make those changes, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really the case of rigid infrastructure. And so what operational leadership needs to do is help be the end that helps tip the adaptability into the operational system to generate new order. So I'll briefly describe each of those. Entrepreneurial is individuals and groups who act as leaders regardless of title to advance novelty, leading to beneficial change. These are people who think outside the box. Again, entrepreneurial kind of thinking. Then we have enabling leadership, and these people are usually in positions of formal authority. And what they do is they enable and protect adaptive space. So I like the pictures below. The left side is the left side of the model, where there's the overlap between the enabling and the entrepreneurial. So what they need to do there is help nurture and protect ideation, the ideation process. Many leaders make mistakes because they jump in on this process and they influence it and they try to drive it when they should leave it to the local group to plan the pressures locally and come up with the best solution. So one element of this is that left side of the model on ideation. The other is really the emergence picture. So this picture that's this topsy-turvy emergence arrow with all of the different directions and nonlinearity and dead ends and all of the things that you run into in emergence, but then leading into tipping it into the operational system. And then the operational leadership, whose role is to realign and loosen up the operational system so that it can accommodate new order. So this is really taking all that messiness and trying to get it into something that's going to work. All right, so I'm going to run through some more things, and then I want to end with some mindsets. So a few more things here. The problem of bureaucracy. This used to be a really relevant slide, and I will tell you it's become less relevant. And that's because bureaucracy has been cut out of organizations. So that is an adaptive process in and of itself, that organizations recognize the problem of this and they've continued to cut it. So now really what we talk about is the challenges of the brick wall. And the brick wall is the problem that you run into when you're trying to advance ideas out and they get stifled or stopped. The big thing that I do in working with people here is get them to understand that when you're driving ideas out from the entrepreneurial system and you're trying to take it more broadly, you're trying to scale it or champion it, you are naturally going to hit conflicting. It's absolutely going to happen. You'll get pushback. And that's part of the adaptive process too. The problem occurs when people take that pushback as a no, when they think that they've been stopped. So it takes a mindset of saying, I get that this is going to hit, and I'm going to go at the conflicting, and I'm not going to go saying, give me a yes or no answer, because if I get no, it's stopped. Instead, I'm going to go and I'm going to say, what do you think of this idea? Or what kinds of problems are you experiencing? It's really the importance of questions to find out where they are so that you can link up what you're trying to do with what their need is. It's about linking up and connecting. And then when you get the pushback, it's about taking it and saying, okay, I'm going to use this as information to figure out what I'm not understanding about what's going on and what I need, how I need to refine my idea. So it's an ongoing process of refinement. In fact, what they say is that, and I don't have that slide in here, what they say is the idea starts on the left, it gets changed in the middle, and by the time it gets implemented on the right-hand side of this, it's different from what you ever thought it would look like. So don't fall in love with your idea, fall in love with what you're trying to accomplish in terms of helping the organization change and adapt. All right, so here are the mindsets. There are 4 complexity mindsets that I just want to introduce to you and mention. There are a lot on the slides here, but I want you to just think about it more broadly. So these mindsets are what are required to function effectively in complexity. The first one is adaptive mindset. And what it does is it helps you get change agility. So when complexity is happening, you can go more quickly through it. You don't go into the valley of despair. You don't fall off. You aren't destroyed by it. You can actually function within it and get across to your desired state more smoothly. So we're going to contrast the adaptive mindset with an order mindset. I don't think that these are mutually exclusive. So I think that you can have some elements of both. What I do believe very strongly, and what I think I know, is that you have to have some elements of the adaptive mindset to make it in complexity. So here's the order mindset. The world can be managed if only we do a good enough job of forecasting, planning, and decision-making. People with an order mindset believe that if we ignore change, it will go away and we can stay as we are. Surprises are bad. They want certainty and predictability, and they prefer tradition and status quo. The adaptive mindset believes that change is a natural part of the world. And given that you all are attending a complexity conference, my guess is that most of you have some belief of this. Instead of fighting change, we should accept it. Change is energizing, engaging, and rewarding. And people who are really extreme at this tend to be more sensation seeking, so they can get bored by repetition and routine. All right, so how do you develop an adaptive mindset? You develop adaptability skills such as creative problem solving, but the other one is acceptance. And I think acceptance is really a key piece of this. The problem with the order response is that people want to fight it. They don't want to believe it. So in the adaptive response, we have to accept, okay, it's different. I liked the old world. I like things the way they were. I liked my life, but I have to accept life as it is and not as I wish it to be. So acceptance is really a critical and key part, first stage of this. And then build resilience. So resilience is the ability to recover from adversity and to move through difficult situations. So we've been hearing a lot about resilience. All you have to do is look it up. You'll see plenty on that. It's learning to roll with the punches. And I think a really critical thing here is reframing distress to eustress. So I said earlier that the problem with the chaos response is we drive to order. And what I will tell you is now what I know is that's okay if it's going to take you out of distress. If you're in distress and you need to go to order, that's fine. The problem is you can't stay there. You've got to then jump back up into complexity, into that zone. And you really want to try to turn it into eustress, which is that positive stress that helps you ideate and innovate. You want to continually update your skills. You want to get comfortable with risk taking if you're risk averse. And the easy way to do that is through small steps. Just take small risks and get yourself more used to that on a micro level. And then if you do enough micro, it'll start to build up for you. And then practice complexity leadership and stay in the complexity zone rather than the order zone in response to complexity. All right, second one is collaboration mindset. And I'm going to go through these really quickly. This contrasts with the hierarchical mindset. So the hierarchical believes that leadership is a hierarchical relation, that it's an authority relation. Hierarchy is the most efficient and appropriate way to get things done. Leaders should hold higher status and authority, so they should be the ones making decisions. The leader's role is to be the expert and guide actions, and the follower's role is to implement directives and obey authority. Now we're going to contrast that with what I started with, the collaboration mindset, which is really about co-creation, so that it believes that leadership is a collective action. It only happens in the co-creations when leaders and followers, or leading and following, combine to generate, co-produce leadership and its outcomes. So the collaboration mindset believes that collaboration is the way to get things done. Now, that's not every case. Clearly, people with a collaboration mindset know there are times when you need to do it differently, but they have a bias toward using collaboration to get things done. The best collaborations come when people switch around leading and following. So if I'm the leader, the role or position of a leader, and somebody else is the follower, they have the identity, role, or position of a follower. What I would do if I have a collaboration mindset is I would be willing to follow my follower when they have good ideas. So that's really the key to collaboration. And the leader should follow others when they have good ideas. Also, this really brings to prominence the idea of followership. which has been ignored and overlooked in leadership research, that followership is about how followers partner with leaders to get things done, and that's stepping in and stepping out as needed to drive outcomes. The emergence mindset is in contrast to the reductionist mindset, and the reductionist mindset is really the scientific way of looking at the world, the scientific method. So it sees it as an assemblage of parts. Knowing the parts, we can understand the whole, linear cause effect, and then restrict themselves to functional or siloed views. So that's basic scientific method. The emergence mindset is systems thinker. So things in one part of the system can unexpectedly affect other parts. So what emergence mindset people do is they zoom in and they zoom out. They look for patterns, they look for trends that could link up and generate emergence. They understand complexity and understand that when complexity is happening, that they are in it. And remember, complexity is not happening all the time. So this means that it's really about understanding when it is happening. They expect and engage with unexpected consequences. They're boundary spanners. They're often interdisciplinary thinkers, and they plan the pressures. As I mentioned the importance of that earlier. They don't try to get rid of tension. They use the tension to drive the adaptability and the innovation, and they drop seeds of emergence. So they look for things that can be linked up, that if they were to link up, that could potentially drive something bigger. And that's kind of the classic thing that entrepreneurs do. And when they're doing opportunity recognition and driving entrepreneurial kinds of outcomes. All right, and then the final one is kind of squishy. I just throw it in here because I know it's important. It's the idea of outcomes, that and the belief that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But the reality is that when it comes to complexity and especially adaptability, there are a lot of things that can't be easily measured, and we haven't known how to measure them. So they're getting missed. So the biggest problem I've seen in my work and when I talk with people is that they don't have good outcomes set up to drive adaptability. We know that outcomes can have unintended consequences. This is just, that we're going to let the students evaluate you. So on the right, the student says, well, okay, fine. It's simple. If you do my homework for me, you get a 5, otherwise you get a 1. The student's saying that to the teacher. So an example of an unintended consequence when we try to drive behavior and we get something that we didn't hope for. And then finally, outcomes. Recognize the importance of how they're measured. Consider the extent to which they drive unintended consequences. And the real clincher here is we need measures that drive adaptability and agility. So yes, we still need efficiency, we still need short-term performance, but really critical is people need to start looking at their reward system, their incentive system, and see if they are doing things that are helping to drive adaptability and agility. All right, final slides, questions to consider. Do I have the mindset to lead in complexity? What can I do to better enable the mindsets in myself and in the others around me? And what's the number one thing I need to do to lead differently? So I think that that's a question that I use with my groups when I'm working with them, and we have a conversation about that. All right, we're in complexity. It happens when we see emergence. We need to be adaptive. We do that by enabling adaptive space, and we have the 4 mindsets. Okay, so we've got a few minutes for questions. I sped it up a little bit there at the end. Hope that's okay. I'm going to actually switch off of this. Is it okay if I go out of slide share so I can see people?
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
There are a couple of questions here. David had first one here. Does entrepreneurial system have a bias towards solving/reacting to surface problems, putting out fires, rather than addressing changing the structure/rules that lead or that led to fires in the first place?
Oh, and that could very well be
a public healthcare system.
Yeah, I think that very well could be. And I think the issue is that the entrepreneurial people are operating in their local, and they often don't see the bigger picture. So they're not often thinking from the system, the broad system level, especially in healthcare. So I think there's some entrepreneurial thinkers who are pretty good at this, and they actually can do this appropriately. But if we know the fact of the local, but also a lot of people who are entrepreneurial really get excited by the ideas. And so like in R&D, they'll drive a lot of really beautiful design, but not think so much about how it can get done. So there are all kinds of things that can happen there.
Okay. Going up a little bit, the question that I missed by Pavel. In the context, I think he was saying, like, is the key for adaptability enablement to move from hierarchy to holacracy or some similar, I'm assuming network.
Yeah.
So does adaptability require,
Yes,
I
you
guess,
have, well, let's not use the word hierarchy, because we're always going to have some hierarchy. That's why I said we're going to have some of these mindsets that they're not mutually exclusive. There's always going to be some hierarchy. The problem is bureaucracy. So it's when bureaucracy sets up systems that they're siloed, they're rigid, they're not able to accommodate change. They have no flex in them. They have no agility. That's the real problem. So I think that holacracy is one example of how to do this, and it works for some people. But I think almost every organization now, with the exception of maybe the government, I think every organization now has more agility in it than it's ever had before. So this process is occurring, and it's occurring because we're in a complex world and they have no choice. So organizations are much better at it, some better than others.
okay. Christian, I don't know if you want to go off mute and ask, but he asked if you could go to the problem slide of the problem of the order response.
Yes. Okay, so the order response, yep, I will do that. And you can go ahead and
I just wanted to just touch on the point that having the right radar for appreciating when the rigid systems, and if you quote unquote bureaucracies, not in the sense of bureaucracy, but when the system rigidity is justified.
Yes, that's right. Now that's different from an order response, in my opinion. So you have to, it's really an issue of clarity for me to make sure I'm really clear. An order response is when they're rejecting that the change has happened. They're in denial. They're trying to take it back to an old, outdated order. So, and that's a little bit confusing from actually jumping to this other order response in this picture here, which is the hierarchical response, right? So there are some times that we need to have some what looks like a hierarchical response. But what I will tell you is I think it's an adaptive response in the operational space. Does that make sense to you, Christian?
Yeah, it does. But if you go back a few more slides, there were some points where you had the problem with the actual response. Yeah, right there. The problem with the order response, the one with the brown box.
Oh, this one.
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
So
yes,
stability.
There we go.
Right, like the key word for me here is equilibrium. There
Right.
is, so I guess now I understand, because you were talking about equilibrium. The old equilibrium is probably not the appropriate one, but there is an equilibrium that is justified at certain circumstances.
Yes. So Christian, this is a really great question. And again, it's nuanced. In complexity theory, they talk about this as valleys and fitness peaks, right? So if you know complexity, the language of complexity is you can end up in a valley and then you can't get to the peak. And so what happens is as complexity is trying to pull you up to a fitness peak, meaning you'll be better off there, you slide back down into the valley. And that's really what this pullback to equilibrium is. It's pulling back to the old equilibrium. So in complexity with COVID, we were all forced into a new world. It is a different world. It's not the same world. And yet we had people like, I'll just say the president of our country who was saying, I'll just ignore it, it's going to go away. Or Jair Bolsonaro, who was saying it's going to magically disappear. Or in England, the leader there was saying that we're just going to get herd immunity. Those are all kinds of things that are really more of a response that's a denial. So I agree with you. I think that what you're saying is more related to this, that sometimes what you need is when it's too chaotic, you do need to go to some order. You do need to have some stability, and you can't drive a system crazy or out of control. You've got to have some element of stability in there while you're still adapting along the way.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. That was a great question.
Yeah, we got like 4 or 5 other questions, and we don't have enough time. We have 1 minute. So
If you have time, I can stay 5 more minutes and try to answer them.
sure. So let's see here. Let me see if I I don't know if this is the last one, but let's if someone were in the business of innovation and actively wanted ongoing complexity all the time, then how would they sustain and adapt to space over the long term? This is from Clark Stacy.
That's a little harder for me to answer. Here's what I'll tell you. I think that a lot of people, and some people I've worked with, have been really enamored with innovation, and they try to push innovation all the time. And I get that, but I did work with a company, and I was called in. It was a multinational company, but I was dealing with the US, the president group, the executive team. And the president was in that room, kept saying innovation, innovation, innovation. So then I went into the room and I said, okay, I'm just going to ask a question. How many of you in here would consider yourself really, really great at innovation? You're highly innovative. And out of 13 people, guess how many hands went up? 3. And the 3 that went up were the 2 R&D people and the HR guy who had invited me in the first place. The president, who was preaching innovation, did not say he was innovative. So I think this word innovation can be a little bit problematic. I don't really think what we want is innovation for everybody. What we want is adaptability. So I changed the question and I said, okay, how many of you consider yourself highly adaptive? Now, how many hands do you think went up? 13. Everybody in the room. So what we want is adaptation and adaptability. Only certain people can innovate. So let the innovators innovate, protect them, let them do what they can. That's the enabling role, foster it. But don't have that impose on the rest of the organization, because it will end up stifling your innovation in the long term because people don't like it. So you want the innovators going, but you want them to be able to slide the ideas in when it's the right timing, when the adaptive space is there, or you need to create the anticipated adaptive space. You need to be proactive in how you do this. I hope that answered the question. And the other thing I'll tell you is complexity is draining, so it will burn people out. So if people are in it too much or too constantly, they will burn out. So you need to find ways to protect them from that too.